All right, I'm really excited to start this episode today because I'm really happy to have Daniel Foch with us, who I met on Spaces, which used to be called Twitter, now it's X. But we've had some great conversations, got to know him, got to break bread with him, and really have enjoyed his assessment of real estate, insights, stats, and everything related to the economy. So Daniel, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your family day.
Yeah, my pleasure.
But what do you think of what's going on right now? Like, this is starting to get a little bit tense and a lot of stuff happening in the media, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we're close to like kind of peak mess, right? There's a couple things that maybe still need to get worse before they get better, I think. But for the most part, like the last year or so, we saw house prices drop, the biggest house price drop in Canadian history in 2022. Then we saw a ripping spring market after that, biggest house price growth in a 5-month period in Q1 2023. And then it's kind of settled. And it seems like we're sort of in that long, cyclical bottom where there's just spring market, fall market, whatever. But what happened before that, like leading up to everything, I think that's decades in the making, right? So last time our housing market peaked was mid-90s, troughed, I guess it peaked in 89, fell till 94, and then it took until 2002 for house prices to get back to their nominal peak of 1989. If you adjust that for inflation, it was like 2012, so it was 20 plus years to get back to the real house price peak.
To illustrate that point, the house I live in today, I'm the third owner. It was built in 1989. It was sold for like $1.05 million.
Okay.
Then in 1996, 97, it was sold a second time for $580.
Right.
And we bought in 2004 for $880. So 14 years, 15 years had gone by. It still hadn't gotten back to that peak that you're talking about. So like there's evidence that supports what you're saying. It's real.
Yeah. And so I guess, a lot of people who, as Canadians, like everybody wants to be bullish on real estate because we have so much exposure to the asset class. Like everyone is trying to live the Canadian dream and own a house. Everybody wants to realize those equity gains that we've seen a lot of people get rich using over the last several decades. And so it seems like there's like greater than half the population that really feels like passionately that house prices are going to go up. And then there's all the people who have been sort of felt ripped off or disenfranchised by house prices going up for 2 decades. And they're all the ones who want house prices to crash. And it's almost like most things become very polar, right? Left and right politics. And this has evolved into a very similar thing. But I think it's examining the core issues that kind of got us here is the fascinating part, because I think that's the only way that we can really think about how things get fixed. So to me, if you look at the big problems in Canadian real estate, number one is just a massive amount of unchecked foreign direct investment, and then through that, systems like money laundering, right? A lot of fraud that's coming out on the mortgage side, a lot of political exposure, as some journalists are, and then also a lot of exposure to other economies that aren't just Canada. We can get into all of that. So I think that's a big piece that doesn't get talked about enough. I think the relationship that Canadians have with housing, this like obsession, this chasing the American dream, using it as a wealth building tool, has really forced us to allocate too much capital from our economy into residential investment. 13% of GDP in Canada. It's like the highest, or one of the highest in the developed world. Residential investment is real estate commissions and contracting, renovations, basically. That by no means should be 13% of your GDP. If you want to be a good, healthy economy, you should be diversified into other things, especially if you're the second or first most resource-rich economy in the world. And so that's like this kind of systemic issue.
How much does ZIRP play into that? Because I've been doing this a long time, longer than an amortization schedule, right?
Yeah.
And when I started in this business, people would get married and buy a house, right? And they'd buy a starter home, and then they would renovate it, And then they would maybe get a pool.
Yeah.
And then move up. And it seems like social media, because I'd like to explore this part of it. How much does social media have to play in all this, where everybody wants everything now? So when they're buying that home, they're overextending themselves because they don't just want a starter home. They want a house with a new kitchen and a finished basement and that entertainment backyard with a cabana and outdoor fireplace and TVs and stuff like that. How much do you think that plays into it? Because ZERP has allowed people to overextend themselves beyond belief.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it just removes the financial cost of being unwilling to defer gratification, right? So like if people are becoming increasingly consumeristic and using their house as a status symbol, which a lot of Canadians do, when it costs basically nothing to borrow and will functionally less than nothing when you adjust it for inflation, right? If interest rates for that period of time were, 1.5% to 3%, let's say, right, during the COVID era, and inflation was 3 to 8%, then when you adjust that, so you take inflation minus the interest rate, the real cost of borrowing is less than zero. Negative. So it was literally the financially responsible thing to do, to take on as much debt as you could, and you know what I mean, and buy the most inflationary things that you could. And not that anyone was actually doing that, like or rationally or deliberately doing that, but I think in the subconscious that kind of exists, where Canadians have this inflation psychology.
But was it a lack of foresight to not believe that rates would go up? Like, because a lot of people seem surprised that rates have gone back up. Like in March 2020, we dropped prime by 150 basis points in a month.
Right. I think it comes from I think it's a leadership issue, right? Like, and there's multiple different like ways that you could describe that, but it could be within the financial system, it could be central banks, and it could be the government. Like all of those groups of people, the people that most Canadians are told to trust with these decisions and guidance, and the people who are actually pulling the levers, were saying rates are going to be low for a long time, right? Tiff Macklem. Interest rates are at record lows, the Prime Minister of Canada, and interest rates are going to stay low for a long time. All of the economists at all of the big six banks were telling Canadians that. And so, like, I do think that there is a bit of a caveat emptor here, right? Buyer beware, that consumers do have some degree of responsibility, but I also think that if you're a leader in a country, you also bear some responsibility for making statements that could have played a part in the mistakes that consumers were making.
Let's delve into the investor side of it for a minute, because fundamentals of investing in real estate is you want to fix your borrowing costs with your rents, right? Like you got your biggest expense, which is going to be your mortgage, and the good move there, or the responsible thing to do, is lock in for a 5-year fixed, right? Because you're matching your rents with your borrowing. A lot of people got greedy and they opted for variable, right? And then you have all these folks with these one-off condos that they're renting out. At one point they were positive cash flow and now they're negative. And how much does the inexperience of those investors play into not being able to make the right decisions and prepare themselves for what's coming? Because if you're a long-term investor, Daniel, you got to know what you're doing.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, it's a great question. So I'll start, there's a couple of different components here from my perspective so I'll start by making a distinction between investment and speculation, I think.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
right?
Because I think we use the word and we conflate the two, and we have. And I think that one of my goals with what we're doing with our podcast, the Canadian Real Estate Investor Podcast, and most of the content that I put out is making the distinction between what's investment and what's speculation. And so to me, when you're investing, you're buying a property because it gives you a yield. And when you're speculating, you're buying a property because it goes up in value. And the easiest way to distinguish this is if you type your deal up into an Excel spreadsheet, into a pro forma, and forecast out the cash flows over a 10-year period. If the deal makes sense without any capital appreciation, without the asset growing in value, then it's an investment.
Yeah.
If it doesn't make sense without any capital appreciation, then it's a speculation. And most people didn't even make the spreadsheet, and that's a big part of the problem.
That's a real big problem.
Right, but that's the easiest way to figure that piece out. So that's number one. Number two is, so I wouldn't call the majority of people who are in trouble right now investors at all, right? I wouldn't, because if people were investing, they wouldn't have been cash flow negative because they would have stress tested that rate element and said, this deal doesn't make sense. They would have taken a fixed rate because they would have said, I might as well get a 5-year fixed because I can now forecast the next 5 years of this investment. It's cash flow positive for the next 5 years. I'm safe. I can literally buy this thing, forget about it, figure it out on renewal, right? And even that's a little bit irresponsible to say I'll figure it out on renewal, but it's better than saying I'll figure it out if I'm wrong on my interest rate assumption in 6 months when the Bank of Canada starts cranking up rates. But the other piece that I think that gets a little bit dismissed was that there was a bit of error from the stress test piece where it actually almost created a little bit more risk than it took away for a period of time, and from the central bank. So during like the most frenzied period of the market, people were piling into variable rates. When you saw it go from like 30% of buyers were using variable rates to like 60 or 70 or over 60%, I think it was, using variable rates. The reason that they were doing that is because they couldn't buy a house with a fixed rate.
Well, it's a really good point. And to illustrate that, when fixed rates went past the 3.25%, where you had to add the 2 points, it was more expensive. Well, you'd borrow less going with a fixed rate than a variable because it's still below that 325 threshold. Add 2, 525 is the qualifying rate. Right.
And so all of these people running banks and the economists advising them and the central banks in their infinite wisdom forgot about the fundamental rule of economics, which is that you have to assume that consumers are rational and that they'll do they'll make the financial decision that best serves them in that moment, regardless of the outcome. Like that, because they don't know, people don't think in medium term or short run, long run thinking. They think today. And what was the incentive in that moment was, I can either not buy a house because I don't have the buying power at 3.25 plus 2% because of the stress test, or I can buy a house because I can get a variable at whatever it was, 0.99, 1.5, and that difference was I can get a reward or I can not get a reward, and they always chose, or I can buy a $500,000 house or an $800,000 house because I have more buying power on the variable. Who cares what happens after that?
But from an education perspective, if you're in that predicament and you're explain the product's benefits, you have the ability to convert that variable into a fixed rate the day after you close.
But only if you still underwrite on a fixed, right? Like, wouldn't you have to go qualify?
No. Let's say you take on a variable. You close your mortgage, you're in that variable the first month. You could lock into a fixed rate any time.
Without them underwriting it.
That's right.
Oh, whatever rate is that they offer you in the contract.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
So where was the education? And that's where I pick on novices. Like, if you have a client in that situation, I think it was incumbent on you to say, hey, listen, you only qualify for X on a fixed, you qualify for X plus Y on a variable. But keep in mind, you probably should be in a fixed. We're at the bottom here. So you should be locking in. Do so a month later. And it would have solved a lot of problems. But going back to the lenders and the institutions, there's a lot of smart people in those banks.
For sure.
Right? If you know somebody's buying investment properties, why offer variables? Why not mandate, if you got multiple properties, that's not a cottage per se, like a second home, and it's an investment property, fundamentally you should be locking into a fixed rate. And they had that opportunity to do that because they know, like, I've heard people say, well, can you show that's my principal residence? And no, well, you can't go from a 2,500 square foot home to a 500 square foot condo. Like, it doesn't make any sense. So where was the common sense? Where was that experience to understand what could be coming? And it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, right? But we're at the bottom. It's only going to go up.
It is interesting. Like, I think that a lot of it is like to answer your question probably in the easiest way is that wisdom is dead. Like, and it's like, it literally dead. Like, the people who actually went through these cycles that like would really have a lot to learn from them are like, in the most part, either have left the industry or have deceased, right? Like really, if we think about it. So Morgan Housel describes this in his book, The Psychology of Money, how like most millennials until now never ever thought about inflation. Like we've never thought about inflation ever because we've never experienced it in our life until the last couple of years. And so we never factored that into investment decisions. We never thought about rates increasing because it literally never happened in our lifetime, except maybe 2016, 2017, when look what happened to the housing market during that period of time. But it wasn't substantial enough for, like today, everybody knows what the Bank of Canada does. Everybody knows the function of the Bank of Canada. Everybody knows what inflation is, right? They know how prime rates work. They know how the overnight rate works. That wasn't the case in 2016, 2017. And that probably would have been, that period probably would have served as the peak of our market.
You know, it's funny you say that, Daniel, because when I first started doing my lives, I put the word inflation up early on and said, this is going to be a word everybody's going to be very familiar with because it's going to be prevalent. And to your point, no one thought about it. Everybody's thinking about rates. No one's worrying about inflation. And sure enough, it kicked us right in the ass.
Yeah. So I think that's like, to me, when you think about it, the way it's described in The Psychology of Money, like people just aren't like, why would we model in, like I can give, to try and give these people the benefit of the doubt. It's like, why would they model in rates going up 3 or 4 times when we've only seen rates go down for the past 30 years, like since that last peak in the 90s. And so that's like, I think that's a wrong, and people should have been studying history and looking at what happened to the housing market in the past during similar periods of time and doing the work of educating themselves when they make an investment. And so I don't have a lot of sympathy for people who are cash flow negative and now have to offload properties at a loss, because number one, if you have enough money to buy a piece of real estate in Canada and take that investment, there's risks associated with it.
But to your point earlier, right? You're either an investor or a speculator. If you're a speculator, there's inherent risk in speculating.
And investing. Like I have no empathy for somebody who went and bought a property, could afford to make a risky investment. So you're going levered long on an asset that went up 10+% on a year-over-year basis. Like if you were to do that in stocks, people would just say that you were probably crazy. And if you were to do it in real estate, you were crazy and it turned out that way and you took the risk and you lost. And somebody else took the risk in 2019 and won because they sold in 2020 or 2021 or 2022. But if you took that risk in 2021 or 2022, you lost. And that's, had you won, you wouldn't be sitting there complaining that, you know, the central bank screwed you over, or you wouldn't be going out saying to all your friends are all like, oh, it's so great to see you're a millionaire. And you wouldn't be like, it's not me, it's Tiff Macklem. But now that you lost and people are, oh, you know, you're broke, now it's Tiff Macklem's fault, you know?
There's a lot of finger pointing for sure. And let's talk a bit about the government's involvement here.
Sure.
Right? Because when we started chit-chatting on Spaces, this was back in 2019, just before COVID.
Yeah.
I was ringing the alarm bells about the student visas, and numbers were creeping up. And, you know, I got a brother-in-law who's in that space, and he tells me some stories. So I got some insight on what that world looks like. Why wasn't anybody keeping an eye on that? Like, it wasn't about education anymore. It's all about enrollment.
Yeah.
And, you know, you got a housing minister today who managed that portfolio.
Yeah.
You know, in May of last year, there were protests at Pearson Airport about people who came in on false admission letters, defrauded by people that sold them a bill of goods, and that they were now being deported after they figured out how to get an education and find work, and now they can't get landed. How does this get missed? How did this fall under the radar and nobody wants to talk about it? And now this guy's responsible for housing people?
Right.
Like, it doesn't make any sense to me.
It is. It's really interesting. So I think it's not as much of a purely federal problem as people want to make it sound. And I'm so surprised that the federal government, they should pay me for this advice that I'm about to say, but I'm so surprised that they haven't purely pointed the finger at the provincial government in Ontario. So the flaw in their policy is that the way student visas are issued is as soon as somebody is accepted through an accredited institution in any province, the province gets to accredit those institutions. And as soon as an accredited institution in a province issues an enrollment to a student, they get a student visa. It's like an almost automatic process. And so that loophole created this messed up incentive where some provincial governments could make it very easy to get that accreditation and become these basically diploma mills that could go out into other countries and solicit students and sell them the dream and bring them here and have this cash cow going where they're charging them triple the tuition fee by comparison to a domestic student, and they're not they don't have to guarantee them housing. They don't even really have to give them a real education. And now, and they're telling them that this is the best way to get permanent residency. And they were, in some cases, even saying that they're being guaranteed permanent residency. What happened was the institutions were such garbage that...
they weren't even institutions.
Right, exactly. But well, in a lot of cases. And some of them was just credible institutions, credible colleges, as an example, that increased their international student enrollment by like 6,000%, as an example, Sault College, right? 4,000% in Canada or in North Bay, right? So 40 times the amount of international students on a year-over-year basis.
Yeah.
Overall, Ontario colleges, this is not even talking about the private and public-private partnership colleges that popped up in strip malls all over the province. So all of those institutions increased their international student enrollment by 240% from 2020 to 2023. And they built no housing during that period of time. And so you have this massive increase in international students. All of that was done at a provincial level. And had the federal government had the foresight to see that was taking place, and they could have shut this down almost instantly.
Okay, so on that point, you make a really good point. This is where I get upset, because I think governments at all levels need to do a better job talking to each other.
Right.
Okay. So the province, the post-secondary education process runs through Guelph. They have the whole, approval process of who gets admitted to different universities and stuff, like the whole application process. That organization set up a verify system for Canada Border Agency Services. And they had to create a portal for a federal agency to tap into verify if someone's admission letter was actually valid.
Right.
Okay, so you have people coming to the country, they're showing up with these admission letters to colleges, universities, and a federal agency has to verify that it's acceptable. They do that because there were so many fraudulent letters happening.
Right.
Nothing gets done. It's all reactive, nothing proactive.
Yeah.
And that's the part that really drives me nuts. You're stamping all these visas at a record pace. Somebody's got to be counting. Like, there's got to be a counter at the door. Yeah. Hello.
You would think, right?
At 300 times what was coming in before. Like, it's absurd. Yeah. And I struggle with it. And the moment I realized something was wrong was when I went down to the States. I got invited to a football game at Notre Dame. First time ever going to a college football game. And it was a whole weekend thing. It was kind of fun. It was senior weekend. And they gave us a tour of the university. Beautiful campus, as you can imagine. And one of the things that stuck out with me was they had an enrollment of only 8,500 students.
Right.
In and around there. And I'm like, hold on, the stadium holds 80,000 people.
Right.
They only have 8,500. This doesn't make any sense. So the guy giving the tour, I said, listen, are you sure it's 8,500 or 85,000? He goes, no, it's only 8,500. That's the amount of student housing we have for each student for the full 4-year scholarship or term. That's interesting. They don't displace any residents of that community with students, with their housing. Mm-hmm. And here we are, as a landlord, I want a student in Toronto because they're nomadic. They leave after a year or two, and I could reset my rents. Yeah. So there's this whole system now that's catering to a foreign student because holy shit, this is really a pretty good return if I could just churn students, foreign students. It's unbelievable that no one caught on to that, and it took 7-8 years.
Well, you look at like markets like in Toronto, it's less visible because on a magnitude basis, like you have, let's say 100,000 students join the GTA. It's already 10 million people in the GTA. So it's like it's a fraction of a percent, right? If you have 4,000 students go to Sault Ste. Marie or North Bay, why do you think house prices doubled and tripled in 2020, 2021?
KW region,
right?
Went nuts.
Yeah. And so, and this is the part that you mentioned about being able to turn over rent is not to be discounted, by the way. Like, I think it's so important that people realize that the incentive, like everybody wants to be a student rental landlord. And one of the reasons is because it's the only way that you can cash flow a house in Ontario for the last couple of years, basically since rates went up. And that could be taken away. Like, I think the sun is setting on that investment now as a result of a lot of this stuff. And we can talk about that, but being able to, so like you said, students, the longest they're going to stay there as a tenant is 4 years. The longest if you're a university student, maybe 6 years if they're like a university PhD plus a master's, but like they're not, they move from house to house a lot. And so the longest that you're stuck in that rent at an agreed upon inflation adjusted or indexed rent controlled amount is 4 to 6 years. And the government right now, especially in the province of Ontario, where the amount that landlords are allowed to increase rent is below inflation. Basically, that's a tax. It's a hidden tax, right? This is where they socialize this cost by taking away a landlord's ability to increase rent at the rate of inflation, even though their costs are going up at the rate of inflation. And they're providing that. Now that protects the affordable housing for the tenant in that unit, but it socializes that cost onto the landlord who's providing the house. And so landlords want to buy places where they don't have to worry about rent evicting somebody or doing some other fraudulent thing to kick somebody out later. Yeah, or whatever. So they're all going to student housing because it allows them to reprice their unit more regularly, and they take back their pricing power, which has been stripped away from them by rent control, and now they're eliminating that tax. And it's hidden in plain sight that this is there and that people are flocking towards it. And it's not just because of that you can cash flow and rent by per bedroom and the student rental system. But so now I think we're at a big fork in the road where they're going to start stripping that away. And I like a lot of people don't see all of these pools of supply sitting in the market that are huge risk factors for the Canadian real estate market for the next little bit. And this is why I think when you look at the 90s and how house prices fell from 94 or 89 to 94, it's a lot more likely that takes place while all of these people who are in pain, who are bleeding out right now, they got to like cut the arm off or something, right?
They got to make a decision. They got to cut their losses.
So you saw it with the Airbnb. I put that tweet out a couple of days ago.
I saw that. But it was a couple days ago.
Yeah, so we saw the government's now they're regulating away these things that they see are competing with or destroying housing affordability. So Airbnb in BC and municipal governments have taken care of a lot of Airbnb in the province of Ontario. Start getting away from the short-term rental stuff. Now you're seeing the federal government and the provincial government going after student rentals, right? The last piece, so those are two pools of supply that are going to start hitting the market. Student rentals probably next year because the cap doesn't take place until next year. And the housing guarantee, we don't know what that looks like yet on a provincial basis. And then the last piece is these people looking at the renewal wall. Until all of those distressed sellers are out of the market or have made the decision whether or not they're willing to bleed out for 5 years or they want to offload, until there's people racing to the exit, there's no reason to think a recovery is even close.
So Daniel, do you think those folks that were in that student rental game will be dumping or converting back to traditional rentals? Because all of a sudden they need capital to put these places back in rentable formats. They've been cut up. They're all doors. A lot of these places are a shit show because students are just, they love to party. Yeah. Do they cut the arm, as you pointed out, and sell so that they're added to inventory, or do they convert at a much lower rent.
Yeah.
Because now they're not getting the $1,000 a door.
Yeah.
And have to revert to maybe a $2,500 a month rent as opposed to $4,000 because they had 4 bedrooms.
Yeah.
Not that those numbers are accurate or not. I'm just
but
there's going to be a lesser rent
Yeah.
when you sell it to one person as
Yeah.
opposed to 4 different doors.
I think it varies, right? I think that a portion will try and convert back where they can sensibly, and maybe be cash flow negative because they think that the asset's going to go up in value or whatever, and then a portion will sell because they can't afford it.
And you got renewal rates coming too, creeping up, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I think both. Like, and I think probably like less than the amount that was purchased will end up coming back on the market, right? So some will hang on, some will switch back to renting out to families or whatever it is. Some might just leave them as rooming houses because that's the only way that millennials can afford. Like the fastest growing household type in Canada right now, based on census data, is roommates, right? So maybe they'll just become rooming houses for non-students. Like,
well, the composition of a mortgage application has changed dramatically. It's now more than 2 people on title,
right,
in the majority of cases because of affordability.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think was it CIBC who just started doing student rentals again?
Yeah.
CIBC or Scotia?
I believe so.
Yeah.
So it's how do we get out of this? So do you think there's going to be a shift with increased inventory over the next few months throughout the year?
Yeah, likely. Well, I think that it'll, like, I don't think there's going to be a flood, right? But I think it'll like everybody has a breaking point, and they know what it is, and we don't know what it is, and the market doesn't know what it is. But like at certain points, people have had enough, and they say, I can't do this anymore. I can't lose $500 a month or $1,000 a month, or I can't keep taking the increases in gas prices or property taxes or whatever, and I'm just going to sell, right? And so as people start to reach those breaking points, some of them it's when their mortgage goes up and they're paying twice as much on interest as they were before. But as like distress takes a really long time to materialize. The people who were like totally screwed or were totally fearful, they exited early in the game. Like that was when that whole thing, that big drop 2020, that was reverse speculation, right? That was people speculating that prices were going to come down, and so they made prices come down because I think it's kind of a sophisticated market. Like Toronto, it's a sophisticated consumer. They behave in a forward-looking way. They say, oh, Tiff Macklem fired the warning shot. Rates are going to go up. Let's dump these things. And house prices dropped 30% in 6-7 months, right? Out of that peak in February. Now we're kind of in this long, slow grind, right? And this is where it's a good market to buy a house. Like, honestly.
I believe so.
When like, and they're one-off deals. They won't even show up in the data, but there's houses out there that are selling right now for 20% below market value, actually. Like, and so it's like, if you're a buyer in today's market and you think the market has another 10% or 20% downside, go offer 20% below market value on every house in the market, because there's some sellers out there that are going to take them. Some
good deals out there for sure.
And people are distressed. Like, they don't care as much about what price they get. They care about whether or not they still own the asset next month, right? And so I guess from a supply perspective, I think it trickles out. I think as people start to hit their breaking point, that all of those listings start to sell.
On the supply point, permits are down. New permits issued are down. The majority of product that has been built over the last decade have been condos, of which 65-75% are 1 bedrooms.
Yeah.
And the composition of the family unit is changing.
Yeah.
You're bringing in families with immigration. If people are here on student visas and they're going to get their PR card, they're going to bring their family over.
Yeah.
How's this going to shake out when you can't raise a family in a 500 square foot condo?
I guess so I'll answer your question with a question. Do you think that you can raise a family in the upper level of a duplex that's 1,000 square feet?
Yes.
Right. I think that's the answer to the question. I think that the only way in which we live a normal life as Canadians, and like birth rate starts going up, it's at a record low. It's never been lower than it is right now, right? So this is, families aren't having kids because they can't afford to, or because they don't want to do it in a 500 square foot box in the sky.
Yeah.
Not that there's anything, like, some people can do a great job with the family thing in the condo. I can't.
We'll bring on the Kramer drawer beds, right? That he used for his Japanese friends.
Yeah. So I think I think the writing's on the wall. I actually don't even think this isn't really that ideological or like profound of a thing to say. I think it's literally out there in the open. It's very clear what the government's intention is at every level, at municipal, provincial, and federal level. We are overhoused as a population. We have baby boomers who have used less than 40% of the square footage of the house.
Yep.
On average, we have the most extra bedrooms per person in the world. We have the third largest square footage per capita in the world. All of that's skewed up by the baby boomers. And this is another potential piece of that supply coming into the market over the next 10 years. Baby boomers are approaching retirement, approaching downsizing. A lot of them plan to die in their too big houses, but they're going to be leaving the workforce, and they're going to be either needing to realize equity to pay for their retirement, or they're going to die eventually, right? 10 years, 15 years, whatever. As that starts to take place, those houses start to come on the market, or they go to the kids through inheritance, and the kids don't want a house that big, right? Like the square footage that millennials want to consume is like 1,600 square feet on average. The square footage that boomers own is over 2,000 square, just under 2,000 square feet, 1935 or something. So there's this big mismatch in space, and rather than it being fixed by the market being normal, and baby boomers being able to afford to downsize, right?
Yeah.
It's taken place in this like massive hoarding issue. And so the government's response to this is, well, we need to encourage these people to start cutting these houses up.
Repurpose.
And so what you're seeing is policy designed and adaptive reuse of these dwellings, which is, Toronto's a great example. Toronto just upzoned the yellow belt to 4 units. So you can put 4 units on any residential lot in the city of Toronto.
And we're doing that right now.
Right. Yeah.
But the process is like unbelievably onerous.
Yeah.
Like
it's expensive. Like, it doesn't work for the majority of the majority of people. Like, you probably got a lot of cash that you're able to put in these deals. If you're using pure construction financing or debt, and you're paying market rate for the land, then I don't think it pencils, right?
It doesn't. You have to, like you said, you have to have the cash flow, the cash injection on the purchase to make it work.
Right.
But what's difficult is the city's still not aligned. Like, the permit department is still not on board with this. Like, you go to zoning review.
Yeah.
Like, I got a project right now I'm working with a client on. We're at zoning review. It passed, and it's being held up because the windows in the back are a little bit bigger than they should be. And it's like, come on, guys.
Right.
Like, let's get this built. We need more units.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a lack of attention and urgency to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And more importantly, I just don't think, if we're at the lowest point with permits being issued and they're this slow, what happens when we have the onslaught of people wanting to get permits?
Well, I think that a part of it is that people are going to ask for forgiveness and not permission, right? So Brampton's a good example of this with the law that they're trying to put in with the landlord stuff, right? And like, I'm just using it because they're the only one who's trying to do this regulating of landlords thing, right? It's like, you got to go get a license to be a landlord now. People are protesting it, right? Toronto hasn't really gone after a lot of these illegal apartments because that's the only affordable housing in the city. And it's going to continue to be the only affordable housing in the city, because I know guys who have called me who own massive houses, and they've owned a bunch of legacy houses. Maybe they're using it as their rooming house right now, or they're renting it to a rich family, and they're saying to me, I'm going to cut this up into a 4-plex. And I'm like, okay, cool. And they're like, I'm not going to get permits. Okay, cool. So there's a lot of and I don't care. It's none of my business what you do or don't do. Like, here's the risks that you're taking by doing that. And so I think that there's most of the supply that's going to be created by a policy like upzoning the yellow belt, and nobody really wants to talk about this or admit this in the industry. Most of the policy that's going to be created by that is never going to be seen on paper, because it's not going. People know that they're going to deal with the issues that you just described to me, and as long as they don't have NIMBY neighbors who are going to come shut them down, and even then, really, I mean, is the municipal government's probably going to come give them a fine, make them get compliant on the permits. It's not going to get that 4-plex, let's say, is not going to get un-4-plexed, right? They're just going to have to spend the money doing it right, or spend the money doing the permits.
They got to deal with compliance.
Right. And so I know a lot of contractors who are building to code and not going to get permits and creating housing right now. Like, this is happening. So that's the Toronto example. The other piece is that municipalities, I think, now have opened the door to they have the ability to compete on something. Like, and this is the first time it didn't matter before, because governments also were benefiting from interest rates going down from 1994 on, or 1989 onward. Well, basically 1981 onward. The 21 interest rate is the last time we saw a big peak in that curve. So governments didn't care because they could issue bonds and they had to pay very little rates on, municipal, provincial, whatever. Like, people think the Canadian government is indebted. Go look at what the province have been issuing in bonds.
It's a lot of
right?
dough.
And they had to pay no interest, and now they don't care. They didn't care. Municipalities, same thing. Now all of a sudden you've got provinces and municipalities that realize that they need to generate revenue. And what's the best way to do that? The best way to do that is increase your tax base, right? And so if I'm a municipality, I'm saying I need to expedite fourplexing houses, because if I don't, we're going to be dealing with this bankruptcy for the next, or on the brink of bankruptcy for the next 10, 20 years, right? And that means that this is the trade-off, right? And I don't think anyone realizes this or thinks about this when they're speculating or investing. If you buy in a municipality that's supply constrained today, people say, oh, I'm going to go buy in King City because it's all greenbelt, 99% undevelopable. They suck at getting permits passed. Not actually true, but let's just say that's like, they suck at getting permits done. Nobody's building new housing there. And so it's scarce. Housing is scarce in that municipality, and so it's going to go up in value. That's true. But what happens as a result of that in the fullness of time in a non-ZERP or a non-interest rate declining environment? Well, now they don't have any money because they're not collecting enough property taxes, which means that the roads get shittier, which means that the public services get shittier, which means that maybe they don't upgrade their municipal pool when their neighboring municipality does, and maybe they can't expand their urban boundary because they don't have the.
But on your point about property taxes not going up, it also prevents people from turning over their homes.
Right.
Like, in my particular case, my dad's 90 years old. He's living in a home bigger than he needs up until late last year, and his property taxes were negligible.
Right.
So if the city avoided putting all the pressure on development charges and new entrants and new construction, and should have increased property taxes on their residents, because that's where they could make the biggest impact from a revenue perspective, there probably could have been more turnover, because as people retire, their income reduces.
Yeah.
And if their property tax component's a bigger chunk of that amount, they're going to say, well, this house is pretty big. It's taking up a big chunk. Maybe we should downsize.
Yeah.
And that property wouldn't be in the hands of somebody who's 90 years old using up one floor, and there's a basement and a second floor still
for sure
empty. Yeah. Like, to your point, we have more bedrooms per capita than
for sure
people. Like, it makes no sense.
Well, yeah, they pawned off the cost of running a municipality, and the idea was growth pays for growth, right? So they say, okay, well, all these new buildings need to be paying for all of the new roads and new services and new infrastructure, and they do that through development charges. And now all of a sudden you have that gets baked into the value of a home. So like 30% of the value of a new home is tax, right?
Yep. Input taxes.
And so all of that tax is paying for all of these things, so that all of these existing owners don't have to pay for these things, right? And that was backwards. Now we're getting to the point where they're realizing, oh, if we need supply to get built, we need to stop taxing it. Like, what happens when you tax? When you don't want people to smoke, you tax cigarettes. You don't want people to use more gas, you put a carbon tax on gas. What do you think is going to happen to housing when you put 30% tax on it, right? And so now, nobody was incentivized to build housing. Yeah. Now if they want to incentivize that cycle to take place, where builders are going to come in and buy all of this old supply and cut it up into 4 units, which is really the only way. It's the most agile and it's the cheapest way to bring supply to the market. Because remember, anything below 4 units in the city of Toronto, no development charges.
That's right.
And so, like, I could own a fourplex, I could own a McMansion or
there's an education surcharge. They still charge that.
Right. Okay. So, but what's that? 10K, 12K?
About $4,300, I think.
Oh, it's so cheap.
No, it's not a lot, but it's still
nominal. Yeah. So, but if I'm a owner of a beautiful old craftsman 1900s house, and it could be right next to a high-rise tower, because that's how bad our planning is in this municipality, right? And that tower would be shaped like a staircase, I suppose, because of the angular plane. But that's another whole thing altogether. But I got this old house, and I could probably put 4 units in that, and then there's a high-rise going up beside me, and that guy is paying for an $800,000 dollar condo that he's selling, he's putting $150,000 towards just the government, and I can put a unit in my house for significantly less on a construction cost basis, but also on that tax basis without development charges. And those units likely will rent for the same amount of money. If not, you might actually see a premium for the unit in the house.
I'll give you validation for what you just said. We got a number of projects on the go, and each unit in these 4-unit properties are over 875 square feet.
Right.
Minimum 2-bedroom.
Right.
That's way bigger than a condo.
Yeah.
Like even a 2-bedroom condo today is 750 square feet. And like if you fall down, you're going to hit a wall.
And what did it cost you to create each of those units?
It's just under $1 million for 4 units. So 250.
250 a piece.
Yeah.
Right. So you just built something that'll rent for probably more than a condo, comparable condo.
Yep.
For let's say less than half the price. Just maybe a third of the price.
And significantly less maintenance fees.
Right.
So that's where we're at.
Yeah, and so investment capital, if they can remove some of the friction, investment capital will go there and it'll create housing. I have lineups of people who want to do projects like the one you're describing, but they're not
banks don't understand it.
Yeah, that's a big piece.
That's the part I'm trying to lobby. I'm trying to get lenders out to kind of understand it because they can't wrap their head around.
You should be the lender, really.
Well, we do the construction lending, but
the takeouts
on the takeout, like they're not really grasping the laneway suite, the garden suite, that rent. Like they're really struggling with it, and this 4-unit idea, they're still hesitant. Like they move slow.
So is that because they're treating it like? Because I know certain big 6 would take multiplexes up to 3 or 4 units.
4 units.
Yeah, with residential debt. But I guess it's like the 4+1 that they're kind of confused by.
Yeah, because from a comparable basis, when that appraiser's out there valuing the property, there's not a lot of comparables out there, and they can't validate the lift.
But this is where I think those early adopters will really be rewarded, right? Because the people who are understanding that, like the ones that are willing to set the precedent and go take the risk and go get an as complete appraisal or whatever it is, that they're going to be, I think, rewarded, because I think we're going to go through a period where will be the primary type of housing that's created.
We have a few lenders that are looking at changing policy this year on it because they're starting to see the take up. So I think you're right. It's going to happen. It's just going to take too long. And until a developer knows that they could get the takeout, they're not willing to take the bite. So everybody's, got to sit and wait. But, I think that is the key, is that high density in those areas where, all you need is a 20-foot lot to get these things built. And there's the opportunity.
We had a big private equity group reach out to us from the podcast that looking to do these. So I should introduce you to them.
I think there's unbelievable opportunity.
Yeah.
But I want to leave on this note. My son pointed out a magnet I had on my fridge. Both my wife and I have a magnet of our year of birth, and it lists the average price of home, the average price of the average income. And he looked at mine. I was born in 1970, so I'm 53 years old. And he said, Dad, the price of a home in 1970 was only double the income. Yeah. And here we are today where it's almost 10 times or more. I know Ron Butler always talks about this. He just really illustrates his point, because everybody says, well, back in the day, it was hard for us to. That's all bullshit. When you could buy a home for just 2 times your salary back then, and now anybody entering the market is looking at almost 2 digits times, there's going to be a problem, and something's got to give. Yeah,
and it almost like it lends more to what I was saying from my perspective. Like, I don't think it's a problem that gets solved by prices coming down to 2 or 3x incomes or 1x income or whatever, like I think it gets solved by 2 or 3 incomes being piled into one household. And that's what we're seeing. Like, everyone except for Canada, the US, and Australia, really, like, multi-generational living is common.
Very common.
And so it's not like, I think that we're just at the very forefront of a cultural shift that leads to us living like everybody else in the world. I mean, you look at, let's take the UK as an example, because they're very politically similar to Canada, part of the Commonwealth. The UK 600 years ago, everyone, London was the financial capital of the world, right? 400 years ago, like before the US started taking over. Everybody in the world wanted to migrate there, and so they were migrating there because they could, because it was connected by land, right?
Sure.
So everyone was going to London, and all of those old row houses got cut up into flats.
Yeah.
And that's where flats started. We're going through the same thing right now, where everyone in the world wants to migrate to Canada, right? They're doing it because they can do it now on an airplane.
Yeah.
We don't have enough houses. We can't build houses fast enough. What happens as a result of this?
We're going to have our version of flats.
We will, yeah. I mean, for sure, I think, right? The Annex is like one of the best neighborhoods. Like, you go to Jane Jacobs, the most qualified person to talk about urban design. She's obsessed with the Annex, was obsessed with the Annex. And that was a neighborhood that was built on old mansions being cut up into 4 or 5 units for students.
So we're going to have to do this again.
Yeah, I'd love to.
We've talked for quite a bit of time. I want to thank you so much. I really love what you do with Spaces, and I know you're giving of your time on a regular basis, and you're a busy guy, so I really thank you for coming out.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we got to do this again.
Yeah.
I owe you lunch.
Sounds good.